Let's begin with history. I'm going to mix it up a little. We'll end with science, but we'll start with history. And as the beginning said, I'm going to talk about gaudy religions. That means religions with gods in them. They all fall in the same way, and I'm going to focus mostly on the Western tradition, but you might start to see how these arguments will apply to even things like Hinduism and so on. Okay, so let's start with the grand picture of history, right? Imagine religions as species of animals, and you put animals in a big family tree, essentially, right, of how they started at one original species and that radiated out into various others, into branches and leaves and whatnot. Now think of religions in a similar way. The earliest religions date at least to 40,000 BC. Now, actually, we have evidence that goes even further back than that. But by 40,000 BC, we have shamanistic cave paintings and other things like ritual burials and things like that indicate that there was some sort of religion going on. 40,000 years BC, think about that. Now, the first priesthoods, we're looking at 10,000 BC when we have cities, or cities and villages and things where we have actual priesthoods established. So we've got 30,000 years where humans are walking around with religions and having religious beliefs before they even get priesthoods. But then finally to get priesthoods, it's still 8,000 years before Yahweh comes along and says, oh, hey, by the way, I am the one true God. And you see, of course, he does this in one tiny little place. I mean, he doesn't mention the fact that he exists to anyone but one tiny tribe of goat herders in one little place. And for another 1,000 years, even after that, he neglects to ever mention this Jesus character, right? So when you look at history, this Yahweh religion, this Yahweh-based religion, even Christianity, just looks like one among many. It makes no sense from the perspective of a cosmic deity who would, of course, been revealing the gospel from, year 40,000 BC. And all cultures, all history would show that this same God was sending the same messages to people in every culture and everywhere from as far back as we have any kind of evidence of religion. Even our written records go back to about 2000 BC, and yet there's no evidence of this having occurred. So history, just in the big picture, already refutes all religions, right? If there was any God-based religion, God would consistently be talking to people with the same message, the same belief system. But that's not what we see. What we see looks pretty much like human invention. Humans are making stuff up according to their local culture and happenstance of history. Now we skip up to look at Judaism. So we're going to start with Judaism because that's the first of the Western religions that's still around and has influenced the other major two. Now, in between 539 and 332 BC, Persia conquered Judea. Now, I want to point out, of course, that those of you who know geography, you can try to find Judea on there, the Palestine, the Holy Land, quote unquote. It barely shows up. I mean, it's basically almost just a piece of a red line of the border there. And compare that, of course, to the Persian Empire. Looks like the Persians had better gods, apparently. But the significance of that is that, the Persians, of course, that means Iranian. The modern-day country of Iran is the center of the Persian culture. It's where everything Persian came from. Zoroastrianism was the main Persian state religion of the time. When they conquered the Jews and then hauled them off into slavery or into exile into other Persian cities, the Jews were much mixed up with and seeing basically the god system of this incredibly, enormously powerful empire that easily conquered them. And they said, well, they can't have a better God than we do, so we better get some of these cool God attributes pretty quick. And so they borrowed a lot of the ideas that the Zoroastrians had and added them to their religion. These are attributes of Judaism that did not exist before the exile. You won't find them in the Old Testament writings that were written before the Persian conquest. But afterwards, then you start to see it happening all throughout. This idea, first of all, of a war of a good God versus an evil God, of light versus dark, that was a Zoroastrian idea. The Jews did not have that. Before the Persian conquest, Satan was actually one of the right-hand men of God and was doing the will of God. So when Satan goes down to cause evil, he was doing it on orders from God. He's not an adversary in the sense of the enemy of God. But after that, of course, Second Temple Judaism started to acquire this idea of Satan as a rebel who took a legion of angels, rebelled against God, and was cast out of heaven, and now is responsible for all evil, and now all death in the world and so forth is this big struggle between the good God and the evil God, God and Satan and so on, which the Christians picked up. But that comes from Iran. That's a Persian idea. The idea that the world will end, that was not a part of Judaism before this conquest. The idea that God's justice would be realized in one great apocalyptic cataclysm, that was a Zoroastrian belief. That came from Persia. The Jews liked that idea. They adopted it. And of course, they turned everything around so that it would be the Persians that God would melt and not the other way around. But the idea comes from the Iranian conquerors. The idea that this world would end by a river of fire being sent by God that will flow over the universe and burn everything up except the righteous, That's Zoroastrian, the idea of the great apocalyptic burning. A new, better world that will be created in its place, the future heavenly paradise kind of thing. That comes from Zoroastrianism. That wasn't originally a Jewish belief. And the idea then, the most crucially, that all the good people will be resurrected by God to live in that new world happily ever after. This idea of an eternal paradise life was not a part of Judaism before. When you died, you just died and stayed dead, basically. You were kind of like a vague spirit in the earth. They didn't have an idea of an eternal paradise or an eternal afterlife, but the Jews picked that up from the Zoroastrians, and it became a fundamental requirement of Judaism. Now, when you look at the Talmud, one of the requirements of being a Jew is affirming that you'll be resurrected. Everyone else is explicitly declared a heretic in the Talmud. And yet, that wasn't a Jewish belief. That was an Iranian belief picked up from the Persian cult of Zoroastrianism. So when you look at this, you realize that this is just man-made religion, right? This is not a single God who thought of all this stuff at the origin point of Judaism. There was no, you look at when God's communicating with Abraham in the Bible, he doesn't say, oh, by the way, the world is going to end at a certain time. I'm going to resurrect everybody. I'm going to burn everything. And there's this awful guy named Satan, and you need to watch out for him. That's not there, right? So all of that stuff gets added on later, and it's borrowed from a human-created religion of Zoroastrianism. So certainly this is a historical piece of evidence that shows that Judaism is not a God-oriented or God-originated religion. It's just another cobbled-together man-made thing. Now, other things, of course, you know there are failed prophecies in the Old Testament, but related to this idea of God, of the Zoroastrian influence on Jewish belief, I'm going to read one particular prophecy that is conspicuous for not having happened, therefore refuting the entire Bible, because they can't possibly be a supernatural deity communicating to these prophets if they get things wrong. And it's also pretty horrific here. And this shall be the plague, I'm going to read. This shall be the plague whereby Jehovah will smite all the peoples that have warred against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall rot away while they stand upon their feet, and their eyes shall rot away in their sockets, and their tongue shall rot away in their mouth. That's, by the way, where Steven Spielberg got the idea for Raiders of the Lost Ark, melting. Here it is. And the same plague shall befall the horse, the mule, the camel, the ass, and all the beasts that shall be in their camps. What do the animals do? That's kind of rude. And it shall come to pass that anyone that is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoever of all the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem, that's all the families of the earth, if they do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, upon them there shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt even go not up and come not, neither shall rain be upon them. There will be that plague too, don't forget, whereby Jehovah will smite the nations that go not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of all the nations that go not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Never happened. Failed prediction. But notice this idea of the apocalyptic end world, and also the idea of the Jews as the master race that the entire world will bow down to. They kept getting conquered instead by other nations like the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans. So consistently, history turned out exactly the opposite the way that God told them it would. And this, we see, even is connected to aspects of, oh, that's a shame. This is not coming through correctly. Well, I can't read the passage. The passage is hidden back behind there, and this isn't playing. Oh, I wonder if I can make it play. Let's see if this... No, I don't want to try it yet. So the passage that's behind there is a passage about how God's going to burn everything up, and there's a funny funny line in it in Malachi 4:1-3. Those who have mobile devices can look this up. And what he says there is that the Jews who are faithful of Jehovah will be able to gamble as calves of the stall upon the ashes of the burned up victims and the step upon the skulls of their enemies. And let's see if this happens. But this is supposed to be an animated GIF from the Terminator, which is supposed to evoke. Let's see if it works. No, it doesn't work. Okay, so unfortunately you lose the video effect. But the joke was that I've heard this, I've seen this before. Oh, right. Yeah. So that's Judaism. And you could go on and on about that. But the point is, it's very easy to look at historical facts and show that it's a man-made religion. It doesn't have a pipeline to God. So it's not a divine thing. And so what they're saying about God is probably not true. But let's look at Christianity. Christianity originated as a Jewish sect. And what they did is the original Christians, is they took Judaism and they took this other fashion going on all around them and combined them to create a new version of Judaism, a sort of super Judaism. But notably, they did the exact same thing the Jews did when they were conquered by the Persians. They adopted all of these Zoroastrian ideas and made their religion different by incorporating this foreign culture that had conquered them. Well, this is exactly what the Christians then did, which is to say exactly what the Jews did again by creating Christianity, is they borrowed all of these ideas of these popular religions around them held by their conquerors, the Greeks and then the Romans, and created a new religion. And some of the gods that their new god or their revised sub-god would be based on, the son of God, right, is all of these sons of God, except the one on the end is a daughter of God. Osiris, Adonis, Romulus, Selmoxis, and Inanna are just the ones that we know for sure had resurrection cults prior to Christianity. There are many other similar gods that could be put into this category, but they're harder to date. Inanna, on the end, by the way, we have stone tablets dating back to 1700 BC, in which she descends to the lower world, into what we would call hell, is stripped naked, put on trial in a kangaroo court, is stricken dead by a death spell, and then nailed up, basically crucified. And then her minions come down and feed her the food of water and life 3 days later, and she's resurrected from the dead and ascends to glory. Sounds like a similar tale we've heard before, right? But it gets repeated again and again and again in all these other gods, each time transformed. All of these stories of all of these gods are completely different from each other, but have the same similar structure behind them. And the ones that Christians would most be aware of are Romulus, for example. Roman state god, his death and resurrection was celebrated in annual passion plays, actually called passion plays. They were actually acted out, the death and resurrection of Romulus every year. It was a Roman state religion. Osiris, Egyptian god. Those baptized, yes, baptized, into his death and resurrection are saved in the afterlife. Sound familiar? Zalmoxis is a Thracian, possibly Celtic god. His death and resurrection assures followers of eternal life as well. Zalmoxis was in Herodotus. Their cult is described in Herodotus, and Herodotus was one of the main school texts that would be used to teach how to write for advanced writers who are writing at the level of the writers we see in the New Testament, who are writing in Greek, which means we can be absolutely certain that the authors of the Gospels read Herodotus, because everybody read Herodotus if you learned how to write Greek that well. And therefore they would know about Zalmoxis. It would not be a coincidence. And of course, Egypt is right next to the Holy Land, quote unquote. Therefore, Osiris would be well known to them. And of course, they were conquered by the Romans, so they would be familiar with Roman ceremonies as well. But I want to caution, some of the gods that you hear on the internet and so forth as being dying and rising gods were not, in fact. Mithras is one of the common ones that you'll hear about. He's not a dying and rising god, but he does undergo a passion. There is a passion of Mithras in which he undergoes some sort of suffering or struggle through which he acquires victory over death, which he then shares with his followers who are baptized in his name. So there is the similarity is still there, it's just structured differently. Incidentally, all the Gospels of Mithras were destroyed, not preserved. The only closest thing we have hints and quotations and suggestions and descriptions in various places in various texts, but no complete gospel. And this is the only one we have. It's actually the picture Bible version. This is a comic book, essentially, of the story of Mithras from beginning to end, with the central event in the middle. But the thing is this is like having a picture Bible without having the text of the Bible. So we don't actually know what's going on in each scene because we don't have the description. But nevertheless, we can kind of make certain inferences of what was going on through it. But this is the closest we get to the Gospel of Mithras, is this stone comic book, in a sense. But what all these gods do have in common, including Mithras and the other ones, they are all savior gods. They are all the son of God, or daughter of God. Some of them are women. They all undergo a passion, using the exact same Greek word, by the way, which means suffering or struggle in that time. They all obtain victory over death, which they share with their followers. They all do this with some form of baptism or communion, or both. And they all predate Christianity. So what we're looking at here is just like the Zoroastrian scenario. This whole structural idea was borrowed and then added onto Judaism. And what you do when you take these elements and add them onto Judaism is what you get is Christianity, right? So once again, we see a man-made thing. And it wasn't a case where, like to Abraham, God revealed in the Old Testament that there's going to be this Jesus figure, and he's going to, if you have faith in him, you're going to be resurrected and all of this stuff. This stuff doesn't appear until, coincidentally, when the Jews are conquered by a nation that has religions that have these elements. So it looks like man-made, not divinely made. So Christianity is just like Judaism, borrowed from other religions. Let's talk about evil. So I'm going to move on into a different period of history. It's another broad scope of history. Let's look at it that way. But we'll start with Epicurus, given this famous line. Is God willing to stop evil but unable? Then he is not powerful. Is he able but unwilling? Then he is not good. Is he both able and willing? Then how can there be evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? That was Epicurus, and as this meme says, atheists winning the argument since 300 BC. There's never really been a good answer to this. But we'll give one example, slavery. This photograph, I don't know if you've seen this before, it's quite famous. This was taken after the Civil War when slaves were freed in America, and this fellow wanted his wounds to be photographed and preserved for memory and disseminated so that people would see the incredible cruelty that American slavery involved. And these are Bible-thumping people, right? These are people who think the Bible is the shit. They did this to him. And this is appalling. How could any god stand by and watch this happening, much less watch it happening being done in his name with people citing his book, worshiping him, his actual worshipers, his actual followers, without saying a word? It's unbelievable. So what is the probability that a benevolent God would have a valid excuse not to say one heavenly word to his devoted believers about this ever in the whole of history, even worse in the time of American slavery? And what evidence do you have supporting that probability? If you're going to make up some excuse, how likely is it, and what are you estimating? What are you basing that estimate on? Those are the questions you would ask. But in reality, from our background knowledge of benevolent beings, because we know lots of benevolent beings, they're called humans. These humans who happen to be nice people, they're among the nice humans anyway, nice humans with the power to speak unharmed, who don't have to fear anything. I mean, if you're God, you're like Superman, you're invincible. You can't have your head cut off, you can't be shot, can't be burned. There isn't anything they can do to punish you. You can't have your job taken away, whatever it is. If you have no limitations on you that will prevent you from speaking, and you're a nice person, you have no valid excuse not to say anything. In fact, when we look at people, all the examples of other benevolent beings who are in the position of having the power to speak unharmed, a valid excuse not to speak is so rare we never see one instance of it. And the word rare, by the way, means very infrequent, which happens to mean very improbable. And in fact, it's got to be at least millions to one against, because we know millions of benevolent people who are in this position who are vocally saying, condemning this kind of thing. If God is not doing it, then whatever excuse he has to be rarer than millions to one against. So that's one way to look at it, and of course you know many other ways to design that argument in terms of pointing out that the excuses just don't hold up. All they do is make their theory more improbable rather than saving it. But I'm going to turn something around altogether. You've probably heard the philosophical moral argument, right? The morals only come from God. People believe there are morals, therefore God must exist, because where else would morals come from? Well, let's look at history. History actually refutes this. Let's treat atheism and theism as two different theories here. Atheism, as a theory, predicts that moral rules will only come from human beings, they will begin deeply flawed, and will be improved by experiment over thousands of years. Note, that is exactly what we observe. Slavery is just one example of many things where the moral rules were created by humans, they were deeply flawed, completely fucked up, one would say, and were improved gradually, very painfully, slowly by experiment over thousands of years. Therefore, atheism is vindicated by the historical record. Theism, as a theory, however, predicts a universe directly governed morally right from the start. In other words, the correct moral laws are disseminated immediately from the beginning. It would have been 40,000 BC, not 800 BC. But we would also possibly see the universe actually designed to be moral. We would have justice laws, stewardship of the world, enacting justice and mercy on God through God. We see none of these things. All of the things you would expect from a moral engineer are not there. But we observe no such laws built into the universe, no stewards or law enforcers but us, ever. So the theistic theory is completely refuted. Its predictions for history do not come true. It's falsified by history itself, whereas the predictions of atheism are completely verified. So the moral argument goes the other way around. So that's for morals. Now I'm going to talk about things, whether they're moral or not, but they're still involve moral concern. Yeah, what ought you do after you wipe your butt? You wash your hands, right? Okay. Everybody knows this, except Jesus, by the way. In Mark 7, Jesus comments on the Jewish tradition at the time of washing your hands and washing your utensils before you use them for meals and washing your hands before you eat. And Jesus says, this is a human tradition. It's not in the Torah. God did not command it. Therefore, you don't have to do it. You do not have to follow this rule. He says that things that go into your mouth can't harm you. Only things that come out of your mouth are evil. And meaning words, of course, but and blasphemies. But the point being is that he clearly did not know about germs, right? This was the best teaching moment in the history of the human race, where if you're a divine being, the one thing you know, if you stumbled across a TARDIS and were able to teleport, in time back to here, and people mistook you for a god and were listening to you, what was one of the first things you'd tell them about is germs, right? Because there's millions of people, kids, women, men, are dying and suffering in horrible ways because they don't know about germs. And simple things, simple hygiene, just cleaning your hands could save countless lives. And you have this guy, Jesus, who's portrayed as going around randomly healing this or that individual isolated person, but doesn't do anything like cholera, done, gone. If it was a god, you could eliminate cholera as easily as laying on hands on the earth, right? Just no more cholera, done. That would be how a god would do it. He wouldn't walk around town like a Benny Hinn clone trying to do faith healing acts. But the key thing here is that if Jesus was God or had any pipeline to God, surely he would know about germs and would teach and say, by the way, that is a tradition of men, but it's a really good one. It'll save lots of lives. In fact, you should do this more. And you should sterilize your instruments if you're going to engage in surgery. There's all kinds of things that you should know about. And by the way, water should be potable. You should make sure it doesn't have germs in it and so on and so forth. And clean your hands after you wipe your butt. But instead, Jesus seems to act like diseases are caused by demons inhabiting a person. In other words, he acts like the same primitive mindset of the time. So here we have conclusive evidence just in the Gospels themselves. Even if you treat them as literal books, Jesus is not God, because God would know about germs. So clearly God has not been talking to anyone. For all of these, it's just examples after example after example. There are many more one could go on. So history proves God's not been talking. Islam's no different. I mean, I'll briefly just say that the Quran also fails to mention germs, incidentally. So when the angel Gabriel was rambling on and on and on with these surahs to Muhammad, you'd think by the end Muhammad would be pissed off that Gabriel didn't at any time mention germs. I mean, that would have been really helpful information. By the way, also so would the printing press and a few other things. The Quran also endorses slavery, including sex slavery, which of course the Old Testament also does. And therefore the angel Gabriel thought slavery was really cool. Keep up with that. Like Judaism, God's promise of prosperity and superiority over all nations was also refuted by the opposite. I mean, almost all Islamic nations are failed states or economic disasters compared to much of the quote-unquote infidel West, which has all the power and wealth. Now, that doesn't indicate that we're morally better than them, but it does indicate that if we're going to talk about gods helping us out, it looks like our God's doing a better job than theirs. But I want to point out that all of these religions are the same religion. In fact, Christianity and Islam are just Jewish sects. They're all just different sects of the same one religion. They're all resurrection cults because they all teach basically the same thing and just differ on the details. Judaism says the world will one day be dissolved, the dead will be raised, and the loyal will become immortal. Christianity says the world will be dissolved, the dead will be raised, and the loyal become immortal. Islam says the world will be dissolved, and the dead will be raised, and the loyal become immortal. It's all the same religion. So let's just pick one and analyze it a little more closely. Now, I can't take credit for this, by the way. I'll read it in a moment, but this is a meme that went around on the internet ages ago. Someone else came up with it. They're pretty brilliant because it's spot on. This is the description of Christianity, dead honest. The belief that some cosmic Jewish zombie can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him that you accept him as your master so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. That is literally the Christianity that was being taught in its first, let's say, 1,800 years, almost 2,000 years of Christian history. Totally makes sense, right? Now, a lot of Christians say, well, okay, that sounds a little ridiculous. Okay, so I get you. That's crazy. So we can make this more sensible. And so we came up with a new and improved Christianity where all that Eve stuff, okay, rib woman, stalking snakes, okay, that's all baloney. We'll grant you that. We'll concede you that. But I still have an imaginary friend who magically manipulates the world for me, and he also magically impregnated a woman 2,000 years ago, and she bore him a son who underwent an ancient ritual of blood sacrifice in order to dispel a curse laid upon me, thus ensuring I will be immortal. Footnote, although I've never seen this work for anyone else before. Now, that's completely honest and correct analysis of Christianity, a description of it, and yet it looks absurd when you actually spell it out that way. But what if someone came up to you and said that they have an imaginary friend named Zalmoxis, who they insist is really real, and they'll never die, because this ancient demigod cleansed their soul with blood magic, which grants them the power of living forever in a magical place no one can see. That actually existed. That was the description of the Zalmoxis cult, which is attested in Herodotus, as I mentioned, 500 years before Christianity. So if Zalmoxis cult is ridiculous, Christianity is ridiculous because it's just the Jewish version of the same religion. But let's go to history more recent. Heaven's Gate cult. The Heaven's Gate cult was in California, and they committed suicide, mass suicide, believing that their souls or the information in their brains would be teleported into a spaceship. They thought they'd get new bodies in this alien spaceship that was flying by the Earth at the time, and yet this whole belief, this idea that when they die that they'll be resurrected in new superior bodies, that's the Christian belief. This is just the scientific version of Christianity. So you have them saying that they'll get new bodies in an alien spaceship flying by versus what the Christians say is that they'll get new bodies in a magical alternative universe. The the weird thing is the Heaven's Gate cult makes more sense, right? Because in point of fact, they're talking about quantum teleportation and neural engineering, which are actual things that exist. We almost have the technology now. We can see how to build this technology within 50 to 100 years. We'll have it. It'll be a simple matter to simply copy a brain and rebuild it in another man-made body. All of that stuff is technology that's within human reach and within human understanding. So their idea actually made sense. There really could have been a flying saucer flying by, and if there was, and that those aliens probably could have scanned their brains and reproduced them in new, superior synthetic bodies on the ship. It's entirely possible. But compare this what the Christians are saying. The Christians are saying not that. They're saying that God needs blood to fix the universe, but only his own had enough magical power to do it, so he gave himself a body and then killed it. Now, when you look at it like this, Christians are talking about voodoo and magic and stuff. They're not talking about anything that even has plausibility. The Heaven's Gate cult is actually more believable than Christianity. So if the Heaven's Gate cult is absurd, Christianity is absurd. So, okay, that all looks bad. But the usual thing is, can't we fix the plot holes with elaborate explanations? And I've misspelled explanations, I see here. Excanations? I was hoping there'd be a joke in there somewhere, but there really isn't. Can't we make excuses? But the thing is, if we have to make excuses, regardless of what they are, and our excuses have no evidence for them, in other words, they don't, because that's why we're making them up, right, on the spot, and those excuses are very improbable, and they typically are, like having an excuse not to mention to your own devoted believers for thousands of years that they shouldn't be keeping slaves. If your excuses are very improbable, then your theory is very improbable. If you have to use an improbable excuse to tack that onto your theory, the improbability of that excuse then attaches to the theory, right? So the theory becomes as improbable as your excuse, or actually more improbable, because if you have multiple excuses, those improbabilities multiply, right? And those of you who know how to do basic probability math, basic multiplying of probabilities, you'll notice that this probability gets smaller, smaller, smaller exponentially. And the fact still is that God has never communicated any essential scientific knowledge, ever. No germ theory of disease is in the Quran, in the Old Testament, or the New Testament, for example, nor anything else that's significant like that. God has also never communicated any essential moral knowledge. For example, he completely dropped the ball on slavery. God has never even communicated any consistent religious knowledge of any kind, despite claims going on for 40,000 years, all these different religions, no consistency whatsoever. So these facts remain, no matter what excuses you make for them. And these three facts are exactly what you'd expect if there are no gods, but they're not at all what you expect if there are gods. Okay, so maybe we can grant that. What if God is a total douchebag then, right? Can't there be one of those? And at least then maybe, yeah, he doesn't care about germs or slaves. Maybe, yeah, he's totally pro-slavery. He wants us to die of diseases. He's a total awful asshole. Okay, but he could still exist, right? So you really haven't refuted God yet. So there's really two possible kinds of douchebag gods. The one is natural beings, which are aliens, computers, and things like that. We could be living in the Matrix right now, and the douchebag gods could be our AI agents or whatever. But we're going to rule that out because that requires positing two improbable universes to explain one of them. So that leaves us with the other kind of douchebag god, which is the supernatural being, the being that has irreducibly mental powers, a sort of a brainless, bodiless, ghost mind that can just will things into existence. There are two hypotheses then left. The God hypothesis, which is that the universe was designed, by a ghost even, to produce life. The godless hypothesis, that the universe was not designed to produce life. And the first thing you look at is when you compare these two hypotheses is that we've done this comparison before, again and again and again. The explanation of lightning, the explanation of disease. Jesus thought it was demons. It actually turned out to be germs. And on and on and on. We have constant millions and millions of examples of where supernatural explanations were proffered and they turned out to be false, and natural explanations turned out to be true instead. Now, when you have a horse that wins every single one of a million races, and you have another horse that loses every single one of a million races, and they're about to go head-to-head in another race, which horse do you bet on? It's kind of a no-brainer conclusion, right? So even from the start, before I even continue, I could fold this and walk off stage and I'd be done, right? There's no probable basis for believing in any gods, even douchebag gods. But I'm going to go on because it's funny. Now, unfortunately, my animations aren't working, so I'll talk you through this slide. This is the history of life, right? So we've got 2.4 billion years. Life began, and then there are about 2.4 billion years after that, where life was just sitting around evolving as single-celled life. Now, in actual fact, single-celled life is over 6 times more evolved than plants and animals just by time alone, right? Animals have only been around about 0.6 billion years. In other words, 600 million years. Whereas single-celled life has been around 3.7 billion years, so about 6 times more. So single-celled life, bacteria, for example, have been evolving 6 times more and longer than we have. So they're actually way more evolved than we are. But in fact, the rate of evolution for single-celled life is actually 500,000 times faster than for multi-celled life like animals, which means that single-celled life is actually many billions of times more evolved than your hand, for example. So single-celled life is badass. Now, that makes a lot of sense in terms of evolutionary theory, but it makes no sense in terms of God. God really likes bacteria. I mean, he spent most of his time working on those suckers, but very little of his time working on us. So what was God doing for the 2.4 billion years fiddling around? And he's got all these single-celled organisms. He doesn't know what to do with them. He can't even figure out that maybe they could work together to do something. And then eventually he comes up with the idea that, you know what, maybe they could congregate together and make more complex entities, like algae. Algae, that's clever. So he creates things like algae where multiple cells can cooperate, but he's still sticking around with those for 1 billion years before he realizes, oh, you know what, maybe I should have these cells differentiate their function so that we can have a more complex animal. Yeah, why didn't I think about that 3.4 billion years ago? Still couldn't figure it out, but eventually did, and he comes up with this differentiation of cells within a multicelled organism about 0.6 billion years ago. But then it takes him 500 million years to figure out apes, just apes, right? So he's tinkering around with mice and bugs and all kinds of this stuff, but no, it takes him a while to go, apes, oh right, maybe I should do something with those. And then even when he gets to apes, it takes him 4 million years more of tinkering before he figures out how to make people. What was he doing for 4 million years? God, these apes are really stupid. Why can't I fix them? They should be smarter than this. Oh, right, maybe I should do something with the brain. I don't know. When you look at this, you realize that this is exactly what we should expect if life is a natural product of random evolution. It would obviously take billions and billions of years for us to evolve. Obviously, single-celled life would have to evolve vastly longer in order to develop the intercellular machinery and complexity to actually start engaging in cooperation. And obviously, once you have cells engaging in cooperation, it would take a very, very long time for them to evolve the sophisticated machinery that would allow them to start differentiating tissues and therefore creating what we recognize as plants and animals. So this is exactly what we expect if there's no God. It makes no freaking sense if there is a God. Even a douchebag God would be more time efficient than this. So what does the godless hypothesis predict? This is what we would expect to see if we are alive, if we exist,
place
and there is no God, and the universe therefore had to have come about by random chance or whatever.
Existed.
What would we expect to observe?
Description of the Zalmoxis cult, which is attested in Herodotus, as I mentioned, 500 years before Christianity.
What we would see is that almost all of the universe will be lethal to life, right? If you pick random universes, you're going to get one that, you know, if it's a universe that's completely hostile to life, obviously that you're never going to be in that universe, right? Because if you're alive, you're not in that universe. So you would never observe that universe. The probability of that being outside when you open the door is 0%. But if the universe is randomly picked from among all the possible universes that could just by chance maybe produce life, then what you're going to see outside that door, if it's not been intelligently designed, is a universe that's almost entirely lethal to life, but life is just a very small, very rare occasional outproduct of it. Now, because we know, in this case, if life is not engineered, if it's not intelligently designed, it has to be an extremely improbable chemical accident. The right chemistry has to come together just the right way. So we know that's a cat. We have to concede that. That's true. If there's no God designing things, there's no designer, that's the only way life could come about. But we also know from probability theory that extremely improbable events almost always occur only in vast spaces and timescales. In other words, if an event is 1 billion to 1 against, but you have 1 billion events, right? So the odds of you having one of those events is actually quite high. So what you would expect to see outside that door is a really enormous number of failed attempts to create life and just one or a few random successes, because that's what you would normally appear to see if there's no design. But that's what we notice, right? This is what we look at. When we look outside that door, what we see is a universe that trudged along for 10 billion years before life began on Earth. We see there are trillions of galaxies, with billions of stars each, and many planets and moons on average per star. And that's just the part of the universe we can see, by the way. The universe is actually predicted to be many times larger than even the part we can see, so that trillions is probably a low estimate, a very low estimate of galaxies. And we notice that single-celled life, like I pointed out, evolved for 2 billion years before multicellular life arose from it. All of these things that we expect to see if life is a product of random chance and not a product of design. We could have predicted that without even knowing it before we looked outside the door. But it gets worse than that. When you look at the universe and map and catalog what's in it, 99.99999% of the universe is a lethal radiation-filled vacuum. Think about that. That's almost the entirety of the universe. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit that is not a lethal radiation-filled vacuum. So God really, really likes lethal radiation-filled vacuums if he's the designer. But it gets worse than that, because once you erase all of that, and let's just focus on the stuff. Okay, there's very little stuff. It's almost all deadly space. But what's left, let's look at that. We just look at the material. 99.999999% of all the material in the universe composes stars and black holes on which nothing can live, right? Think about that. Like, most of the matter in the universe is dedicated to these gigantic things called stars and black holes that are vastly huger than planets. All that mass, and they are exactly the one place where life is not going to be found. They're incredibly lethal and hostile to life. You can't live there. And then, okay, so set aside all of that and just look at the tiny little crumbs that remain. 99.99999% of all the other material in the universe, space dust, asteroids, planets, moons, is barren of life or inhospitable to life. That's an extremely bizarre thing to observe for an intelligently designed universe that's supposed to be custom built to make life, right? This is actually the opposite of what we would expect then. But this is exactly what we'd expect to see the moment you open the door if there is no God, because the only universe we could be in is one like this. Or at least the probability is extremely high. That's what we'd see. And I want you to think about this in terms of scale. Imagine this house that I've got up here. Now imagine this house contains the entire universe that we know about, the entire known universe. The amount of volume in this house that would be hospitable to life, the rest of it is completely entirely lethal to life. The amount of volume that would be hospitable to life would be smaller than a single proton. Not smaller than a bacterium, even smaller than the proton in an atom in a bacterium. If you walked into that house, you see that it's almost entirely lethal to life, and you couldn't even find the one proton that life was living on in there. Would you conclude that the house was designed to create life or designed to be hospitable to life? No, you'd conclude the opposite. Now, it's worth pointing out that Aristotle actually thought the universe was much more conducive to life than this, and he described it a complete cosmos. In going all the way to the stars, it was completely inhabited and completely inhabitable. Aristotle's universe was 10 to the power of 30 times more hospitable to life than ours is, which means Aristotle is a vastly better engineer of universes than God would be, apparently. Maybe I think even a douchebag God could outdo Aristotle, but evidently not. So the results. We cannot predict any distinct features of this universe on the God hypothesis. Almost all the distinct features of it are unexpected. To the contrary, the God hypothesis predicts very different observations should be made, but we can successfully predict numerous very weird features of this universe, its vast size and its incredible lethality and all of that, on the godless hypothesis. In fact, the probability that the universe would look like this, the way I've described it, is 100% expected. It's exactly the universe we should expect to see the moment we look out the door. Now, so then what they'll come up with is, well, but fine-tuning is so improbable, and the universe requires fine-tuning. The problem is that their God requires more fine-tuning. In fact, they're proposing, first of all, they're proposing something we have no evidence of, a brainless mind, a mind without a body. We have no evidence that that's even a possible thing. So they're already off the rails from the start. But even if we grant them that, what they're proposing is that there is a mind that just happens to exist for no reason, that is at least as complex as a human mind, because he has to be at least as intelligent as a human and have at least as much knowledge as a human. In reality, of course, their God, they're imagining, is vastly greater than that and therefore vastly more complex. But if you're going to pick random soulless or random bodiless minds out of a grab bag of all logically possible bodiless minds, and you want to get something that's human intelligent or better, you're going to have to get information specificity equivalent to human or better. In fact, information specificity, the complexity of human intelligence, is in the vicinity of 10 to the power of 5 billion. So think about that, 10 to the power of 5 billion. That's extraordinarily unlikely. In other words, the attributes required for a creator are extraordinarily improbable attributes to have. Theology thus posits an even greater coincidence than a random universe. They want to explain a mildly finely tuned universe by positing a massively finely tuned God, and not explaining where that fine-tuning came from. And maybe they'll go to gods all the way down, like the turtle argument, but I think that's a losing way to go, and you know they won't go there. So here's the summary. No moral God is likely to exist on present evidence, quite clearly. Only very improbable excuses can rescue God from that. No supernatural causes or communications have ever been discovered, but millions of natural ones have. Excuses make no difference to the resulting probability. And the universe is contrary to predictions of any likely God hypothesis. Only improbable excuses make it fit. And the universe is exactly what is predicted by the godless hypothesis. Even really weird predictions come true. And that's the state of things, and that's where we get from science and history. So we could write Ulan Khulufad's book long before he actually is supposed to have written it, according to Douglas Adams. And I could say, well, that about wraps it up for God. Thank you.
Well, if the resurrection never actually happened, then Jesus may be safely dismissed as just another interesting but tragic historical figure.
That is true. Sounds like investigation is in order.
Where the hell does that all come from? Ew. Damn. Well, you know, it almost seems that Richard Carrier pretty much wraps it all up. I don't necessarily need anyone to come in here and prove me wrong that all gods are imaginary, because Richard Carrier just did it. However, the offer is still open, because there are many people, I know there are many people who think they know 100%, that their God exists. This makes me wonder, I mean, if you know 100% that your God exists, then so that must be 100% that your neighbor's God doesn't exist, if your neighbor's God is different. Correct? So it all makes zero sense. Okay, so here is the way it works. I sit waiting for my prey here. Okay, it's a Google Meet room. I'll just click on there you go. You'll be able to see there you go, that I'm in the room. You can hear me talk. You can see me talking by the waves that are produced by me talking. So the way to join is on the screen, but you can't click on that. So if you just go up to the top of the chat on the side, there's a link there. Alternatively, there's another way to join. You can actually join with your phone, just with your phone and nothing else. And the way to do that is to dial 226-314-8544, enter pin 281-480-182, and press the pound sign. And you'll be in. Now, while we're waiting for participants, I do have a a video that I'd like to play, and it is not there, but it's Kip Davis. Anyway, Kip Davis, what he does is he has a series of a critical response to, is Genesis 1 to 11 reliable? This is part 1. I haven't listened to it yet, but I suspect we will be listening to it now. So I'm going to start it. I don't know how visually necessary it is, but if it is, I'll bring it in, okay? And I'm going to introduce it somewhere. How about over there? There we go. One moment, please. Ooh, there we go. Ah, okay. I think we're getting somewhere. Please bear with me. There we go. Just resize and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So, there we go. Why can't I see that? Ah, okay. Okay, I think I'm ready for you guys. I'll play the video and set up all the other the other links and the join. I like the join by phone. I actually want to know if it works. If anybody's joined by phone, let me know that you have joined or are joining by phone. So I'll just start this guy again.
Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I probably spend far too much time on YouTube, which led me recently to see a video on the Capturing Christianity channel that caught my attention. It's a presentation by this cheery-looking fellow, Michael Jones, who runs an apologetics website called Inspiring Philosophy. The title for his talk is The Reliability of Genesis 1 to 11. Now, this is admittedly a little out of my own wheelhouse, but I really like Genesis and Pentateuchal narrative. I've had the opportunity to teach classes on these texts in the past, and truly relish the chance to explore the fascinating and multi-layered traditions behind them. So, when Jones and Capturing Christianity put on a full-hour talk about some of the most interesting content in the Bible, you better believe I was ready and eager to see what they had to say. Unfortunately, despite the accumulation of numerous bits of data to make his case, I found this video frustrating. Not only does it strawman scholarly positions on the formation of the Pentateuch, but it also appears to follow from a complete failure to understand the source theories of biblical composition more generally. This is nothing new for evangelical scholars, but with this video, I felt it necessary to respond and set the record straight about Genesis. At the outset, Michael Jones says that his 132 slide presentation is an accumulation of small pieces of evidence that make a strong case for the historical reliability of Genesis.
What I'll say is, what I get from a lot of skeptics is when I start going through this data is they'll take one piece of the data and go, well, that doesn't really amount to much. Yeah. Individually, all these pieces I'm going to go over are not going to amount to much. My argument is that collectively, together, they make sort of like a big punch. These all work together to argue that Genesis is old, reliable, goes back to a very ancient time, and it is internally consistent, so it probably wasn't this sort of documentary hypothesis, which we'll get into later.
Now, I can readily agree that individually, the points raised to make his case don't amount to much, and as such, most of them can be ignored. Jones spends a fair bit of time arguing from various bits, such as place names, the appearance of a few Akkadian cognates, parallels to ancient occupations, literature, and numbering systems to make his overarching point that Genesis 1 to 11 belongs more comfortably in the Bronze Age than it does in the post-exilic period. At one point, he showed how the geological description of Eden in Genesis 2 could reflect the very ancient topography of the Fertile Crescent and the occurrence of a flood, albeit a flood that was local and protracted over a long period of time. So I can concede all sorts of these small observations, and in some sense I agree. Yes, there are plenty of elements within the first 11 chapters of Genesis which indicate at least a memory of a very distant past. But why does this matter? And what does it mean? Jones attempts to marshal from a large collection of these small features an argument for the unity and antiquity of all of Genesis. How ancient? Well, at one point he indicates a belief that Genesis was written during the reign of Solomon, that is, sometime before 900 BCE.
Why could it not be dated a little bit later? Honestly, I would put Genesis during the monarchy of Solomon, or David maybe, because I think that would, given themes that come in Genesis 12 and after, I think it better fits with that time period.
In fact, some scholars readily recognize that portions of Genesis may go back this early. But what is significantly problematic for Jones's larger take here is what he has either ignored or flat out gotten wrong, and which rather forcefully mitigates against both of his two strong points. No, Genesis is not internally consistent. And no, Genesis as a whole did not exist at the time of Solomon. So, without countering all of his individual points, I've chosen to focus on those which essentially invalidate his case. I am presenting these in 3 sections, which I envision to comprise 3 individual videos. In this first one, I will point out a number of the outright errors which don't serve Jones's cause. In the second video, I will address problems created by the false dichotomy of options that he has provided for dating Genesis, and also his straw man depiction of the scholarly position on the construction of Genesis from material written over a longer period of time. Finally, in the third video, I will provide a discussion about the documentary hypothesis and the evidence for how we know about the transmission and dating of the Pentateuch. So, let's begin. There are small errors in Jones' presentation, most of which don't really amount to anything meaningful, but some of these do illustrate, I think, a general sloppiness in some of his research. Most particularly, I'm bothered by the seeming inability of his program to write properly in Hebrew. In his discussion about divine snake beings in the Hebrew Bible, Jones shows several slides that have the Hebrew word saraf used to describe these creatures, but written backward. That's better. This happens again in a later slide where he discusses the headwaters of the 4 rivers in Genesis 2:10 and has typed the Hebrew word rosh backwards. I mean, why even bother if you can't type it correctly? Speaking of the magic snakes that appear in the Hebrew Bible,
I also want to talk about the word for seraphim, that we see. So think of Isaiah 6. God is surrounded by the seraphim when Isaiah has this great vision of God up on his throne and whatnot. Now, interestingly enough, seraph is another run-of-the-word mill for like a poisonous or a fiery serpent. It's not just a word for an angelic being, it's also a word for serpent. And you could basically see it probably actually comes from the Egyptian word. So Trygve Menninger notes there is now an emerging consensus that the Egyptian Uriah serpent is the original source of the seraphim motif.
Jones's entire point here is to ground the seraphim from Isaiah 6 in the archaeological parlance, but also to connect these creatures to the serpent in Genesis 3, and then to show allusions of ancient Egyptian snake motifs drawn from the pyramid text and the story of the snake in the Garden of Eden.
There seems to be far more interesting connections there. Now that would be available, obviously, to Moses, who would have been serving in the court there at that time period. And I'm not saying he sort of just copied it. I'm saying there were similar theological themes between the Egyptians and the Israelites in terms of the existence of these otherworldly serpents and how you're supposed to deal with them.
So Jones is correct about the similarities between some of these connections, but I think he overstates the closeness of serpent traditions to the ancient Egyptians at the expense of other surrounding cultures. The truth is, serpents were extremely common as divine symbols throughout the ancient Near East. But beyond this point, Jones also makes a series of errors, in particular in how he understands the Hebrew word saraf, on which he attempts to build his case. First, remember that Jones has said that the Hebrew word came from the Old Egyptian word urias. This is not true. The word saraf also appears in Ugaritic and Akkadian, as well as much later Egyptian Aramaic. So while the concept of a flying divine serpent being was shared by the Egyptians, the word itself most certainly did not stem from an Egyptian word. Jones makes another error here by identifying the creature specifically in Numbers 21:6-8 and Deuteronomy 8:15 as seraphim. They are not. Rather, these are the Han-Hoshim Hasforim, where the Hebrew word saraf is an adjectival modifier for the noun nachash, which also means serpent or snake.
Now think about Genesis 3. Was it a talking snake? Yes and no. It was a talking snake, but it wasn't a gardener snake or a king cobra. It was an otherworldly serpentine being.
Except the serpent in Genesis 3 was not a saraf. It was a nachash. To my mind, the existence of magic, otherworldly, serpentine beings does not in any way bolster the reliability of Genesis, but rather emphatically demonstrates the mythic components of this creation story in Genesis 3. Jones says that saraf is another run-of-the-mill word for like a poisonous fiery serpent. But in 4 of its 5 usages in the Hebrew Bible, it is not at all clear that it has any actual run-of-the-mill application. On the contrary, the supernatural quality of these beings actually draw into serious doubt the historicity of texts like in Numbers 21, 6-8, where Moses must forge a magic snake idol in order to save the Israelites from the attack of otherworldly, flying, burning serpent creatures. The notion that the snakes in this passage are otherworldly beings is admittedly a minority view, but my point is this: the ambiguously mythic details scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible do not in any way help to rehabilitate its historical reliability. Rather, quite the opposite. These elements only serve to further confuse the matter, and they demonstrate how seamlessly the Bible writers and editors were able to weave myth into history. Jones spends the first few minutes of his presentation discussing the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, a complicated genealogy formed from at least 2 sources that illustrated Israel's relationship to its more distant neighbors and to the great powers of the ancient Near Eastern world, Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon.
We all know the Table of Nations. It's the part you don't read. You skip over that because that's boring. But if you actually get into some of the details here, there's a little bit of interesting data within the Table of Nations, which argues that it probably dates to early Bronze Age or middle or even middle Bronze Age. I'm talking the time of Abraham even.
Jones provides 7 key points, which he believes make his case. A few of these are so insignificant, they barely warrant any mention at all. For example, Jones thinks that the appearance of the cities Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 10:19 shows that the text here must be very early, because they were presumably destroyed around 1600 BCE. But then he fails also to mention references to these cities from later biblical texts in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos 4:11, and Zephaniah 2:9. This amounts to a whole lot of "so what?" Jones also thinks the affiliation of the Philistines with the locale Casluhim rather than Caphtorim might reflect an earlier memory of their origins, but again, so what? Especially given the explicit mention of the Philistines, who did not arrive on the east coast of the Mediterranean until the very end of the 2nd millennium. Moreover, attempting to identify actual archaeological sites with place names like Sodom and Gomorrah or the incredibly obscure Casluhim is extremely problematic. Without even knowing where these places were, it's impossible to draw arguments from their supposed antiquity in support of the veracity of the Bible. Jones also points to the highlight of Aber as the ancestor of the Hebrews, and to the occurrence of Akkadian names as somehow meaningful here. I will talk about Akkadian later, but for now, it is important to note that these points don't actually provide any indication of a Bronze Age dating for the Table of Nations. While he highlights these aspects of antiquity, Jones completely ignores others. For example, he fails to account for Yavin in 10 verse 2, which first appears in Akkadian records from the 8th century BCE. Kittiim in 10 verse 4 as an identifier is also considerably late, appearing most prominently in biblical books Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and several 2nd or 1st century BCE texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, apart from these small errors, Jones goes on to make some sizable ones in his treatment of the absence of the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites from the table, his argument about the primacy of Sidon, and his point about the disassociation of the Medes from Persia.
First thing to note is it lacks mentions of Israel's later neighbors, like the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomite, like in Edom. These were important for Israel in the first millennium BC. If you're going to do a survey of the surrounding nations, you'd think you would include these groups as well.
On the face of it, this sure sounds like a sensible point, but it actually betrays a huge oversight on Jones's part. Who were the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites? These were neighboring peoples on the border of the Iron Age Israelite tribal confederacy. They were the closest related ethnic groups to those who identified themselves as the sons of Jacob or as Israelites. So, why is this a problem? Take a look at the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and ask yourself at the outset, where are the Israelites in this genealogy? Jones has drawn a chart that looks something like this as a means to illustrate his various points which follow. And we'll get back to this same chart when discussing the documenting hypothesis later. The table is an inventory of the descendants from Noah's 3 sons, Japhet in 10 verse 2 to 5, Ham in 10 6 to 20, and Shem in verses 21 to 31. While the sons of Israel descend from the line of Shem, this particular accounting of his offspring ends with the sons of Yoktan, verses 26 to 29, who was 4 generations removed from Shem. In Genesis 11, there is another genealogy. This one, considerably less complex, and with its focus set exclusively on the line of Shem, ending with Abraham, his brothers Haran and Nahor, and Haran's son Lot. Abraham's first appearance in Genesis does not occur until after a full 9 generations after Shem. Abraham's 2 sons are Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac's 2 sons are Jacob, the progenitor of the nation of Israel, and Esau, the patriarch of Edom. They were twins who are not mentioned until Genesis chapter 25. Moab and Ben-Ami, the father of the Ammonites, were born from the unsanctioned coitus between Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot's daughters, and this is not recorded until Genesis 19 verses 36 to 38. So, what is the problem here? Jones is arguing for the antiquity of the Table of Nations, from asking a question that the text was never in a position to answer, regardless of when it was written. Does the absence of Israel's later neighbors from this genealogy invalidate a post-Bronze Age dating for the text? Not in the slightest. The Iron Age sources of Genesis were telling a story, and the absence of Moab, Ammon, and Edom is completely uncontroversial because they had not yet emerged at this point in the arc of the narrative. In short, this is a non sequitur.
Another interesting point is that in the Table of Nations, Sidon is listed to represent the Phoenicians. Now, this is interesting because Sidon was more of like the primary city for them in the 2nd millennium BC, whereas in the 1st millennium, Tyre sort of becomes the more prominent city, and Tyre is missing in there.
One of the frustrating features of Jones's presentation is the absence of a lot of his source material. Yeah, he has provided some footnotes at the bottom of the screen where he presumably gleaned a lot of the information for this section, but this specific claim is a curious one, since it is patently false. There is every indication that Sidon was an active, thriving center of Phoenician rule and culture all the way through to the Babylonian expansion in 580 or 79 BCE. an incident that was mentioned by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 25:22 and 27:3. Jones asserts that Sidon's prominence was replaced by Tyre in the first millennium, yet there is ample evidence which invalidates this argument. 1 Kings 16:31 calls the Phoenician king at Baal the king of the Sidonians. 2 Kings 23:13 identifies Ashtoreth as the abomination of the Sidonians, which was included in Josiah's 7th century religious purge in Judea. The evidence is not just restricted to the biblical text. Sidon was remembered on Seleucid coins from the 3rd century BCE as the mother of Tyre. Sidon is remembered 17 times in the Homeric epics, all without the inclusion of Tyre. The 8th century Phoenician king Hiram, not the biblical Hiram, is called the king of Tyre in inscriptions belonging to Tiglath-Pileser III, but then is referred to in Cyprian inscriptions of the same period as the king of Sidon. Honestly, this is a completely vacuous point.
Another minor point, it mentions the Medes as a more prominent people group instead of calling them like the Persians and the Medes, which you would expect later given the Persian Empire.
I will talk a lot more shortly about how problematically Jones has set the parameters of his argument between either the Bronze Age or the post-Babylonian Persian period for the writing of Genesis, while he completely ignores the 600 or more years gap that separates them. Jones does go on to say,
now that could be consistent with a very early Iron Age, but it also fits with Bronze Age ideas.
This is a bewildering claim, since the Median kingdom is not known from any historical record prior to the 9th century BCE, and it was clearly decentralized until the 7th century. I'm reading here from the Anchor Bible Dictionary. Medes first appear in the Neo-Assyrian account of a military campaign in 835 BCE in central West Iran. Continuing references to West Iran in Assyrian documents from the 9th to the 7th centuries BCE show that the Medes were concentrated in central West Iran in the area of modern Kermanshah and along the high road leading to modern Hamadan. To the south lay the kingdom of Elipi, to the north the kingdom of Manea. It is clear that in the 9th and 8th century there is no unified kingdom of Media. The Assyrian texts speak of many small polities, which are of either mixed ethnic composition or primarily Median, but which were ruled by kings or tribal chiefs. The Median language documented in onomasticons, some place names, and loanwords in Persian is Old Northwest Iranian, possibly the ancestor of modern Kurdish. There is, however, evidence in cuneiform texts for growing Median political unity during the 7th century. If anything, this is a pretty straightforward indicator of a first millennium construction for the Table of Nations. There is a terminus a quo after the unification of the Medai in the 7th century, and a terminus ad quem before Cyrus the Great's conquest in the 6th century. But it's not just this single point about the Median kingdom. Evidence from other mentions of Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical text point to a construction between the 8th and 6th centuries. Evidence from the mention of Sidon actually points to an 8th century construction. Several points of evidence seem to show rather clearly that the Table of Nations cannot have been composed at any point before the early 8th century BCE. I think that this catalog of errors on its own invalidates Michael Jones's overarching argument for the reliability and antiquity of Genesis, but there's more, a lot more. In the next video, I will show how Jones has stacked his case about Genesis on the basis of a serious false dichotomy, and how this plays into a straw man argument about scholarly opinions of the formation of Genesis. That's all for now.
Well, there you go. Hello. So I discovered something very interesting. That I need to start my streaming, my broadcast, 1 hour later. Because I started at 5, I've been starting at 5 p.m. my time for the last couple of days. But I noticed today, specifically, I started at 5. It might be because it's Sunday, I don't know. I started at 5, and for the first hour, literally for the first hour, not one person joined. As soon as 6 o'clock hit, people were interested. So I think I'll move it to 6 o'clock every day. Okay, so the challenge is on. You can come on and prove me wrong. You can come in and talk about anything else if you like. It's, it's not a you don't have to prove me wrong if you can't, but you don't have to not be here, because I could always learn something from you, something else anyway. And the third option, of course, is to continue with the series that we just watched, the Kip Davis's is Genesis 1 to 11, reliable, a critical response to someone who calls himself Inspiring Philosophy. I've watched a video or two of Inspiring Philosophies, and he's not inspiring shit. So what do you guys want? Should we continue with the video series? Or would you like to come on in and prove me wrong that all gods are imaginary? Or just come in and shoot the shit, whatever you like. Oh, I should get my timer ready so I don't just sit here waiting and not knowing what's going on. All right, I'll get my timer ready. You give me 1 minute. I'll play some music for you while you wait, okay? Yeah. Oh, that was great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll put the timer up. So I'll start the timer for 5 minutes, and during that 5 minutes, you have a chance to join the chat room, and we can get at it. If the 5 minutes is up, then I'm going to make a decision whether to carry on, because I am 90 minutes into it right now. I never really wanted to go past 2 hours, but I could do 3 hours if I suppose. If it, we'll see. This is okay. So here's the deal. You can come in and chat anytime. Now I'll just stop the video or the music for 5 minutes. Where I'll just play the music and you guys can groove out. After 5 minutes, if there's no response, I will either carry on with part 2 of Kip Davis, is Genesis 1 to 11 reliable, or I will call it a night and say that, well, there you go. Nobody could prove me wrong today, and I'll come back tomorrow. So that's the story. I've got things to do, like fill up my coffee, and well, that's the most important thing, and I think I should get down to it. So, what do we got going here? All right, so music on, me off. Okay. Well, that was your 5 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. I do have a question. So let me ask my question, but first I've got to put my headphones on. Otherwise, I don't know what kind of feedback will be going through the system, so let's not even try it. Yeah, like, okay. This was my plan. When I came back after the 5 minutes, I was going to see if there was 0 viewers, nobody's watching, then I could say, bring in the thank you for watching and good night. But I see there is 1 viewer, and thank you. Well, I thank you very much for being here. Are you waiting for someone to come in and answer my challenge? Would you like to yourself? Would you like me to carry on with the Kip Davis series? Let me know in the chat, please. Do I need to reset the timer to 5 minutes before I get a response? All righty then. Response noted. So, what we'll do is I will say I shall see you tomorrow at around 6 p.m. Pacific. And there you go. This is the room that we will be talking in, conversing in. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, stay rational.
Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño de mi corazón a la República Dominicana, la casa del merengue y la casa de la bachata. Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño de mi corazón a la República Dominicana, la casa del merengue y la casa de la bachata. La casa del merengue